my name's Suzi, Staff Director at Hula. So my role day-to-day is all things employee experience, from hiring to retiring, but also consulting with our global clients in terms of their employee experience journey and how the tech that we create at Hula has a role to play in that, but also their wider work tech too. So just jumping straight into the deck. So I've been in the world of HR for 5+ years now. And when I started and was looking at HR strategy, particularly when I took on a HR leadership role, what I tended to see that culture was very much based on this systematic process of, if you do X, then Y happens, or you need to do A, B, and C to get that output that you wanted. So at Hula, we have a bit more of that flexible approach, which is based on 7 pillars that make up a great culture. So the first one being around vision, which starts from employer brand, from recruitment. When you're bringing great talent into your business, they need to see the vision that your organization has, where it's heading, that why you do what you do. They need to understand how their individual role aligns to that, so what their purpose is and how you continue to empower that throughout their employee experience journey. Leadership, clearly this is amazing when it's led from the top and done well, but more so I feel like managers have such an important part to play in that and are actually one of the greatest influencers of a fantastic employee experience journey for your people. Inclusivity clearly goes without saying, to be inclusive always in what you do and quite intentional in the way that you do that. To be appreciative, to provide opportunity for growth, not just in terms of career growth, but also that personal growth journey that your team are going to go on when they're with you, and then that balance. And if you can do all of that, and I think it's really important to note that these different pillars have different impact at different times. There's going to be times where one is really clearly needed or is dependent on what's going on inside your business with your people in the wider world, of where that focus is going to be at different times. So very much a fluid sort of model that if that works in the way that you hope it to, you see that increased engagement and retention across your people. Your people feel more empowered, valued, and motivated, and ultimately that helps them to drive a better customer experience, which will impact your business performance and profitability. So I feel like I could talk about this all day, and it's a lot to get into 25 minutes. So I've grouped this into sort of 5 themes of some of that journey that you might go on. But before you go on any journey, and this I think can be very different to different organizations based on where you are at that time. So if you're right at the start of that journey, then this is quite easy. If you're trying to do a culture shift, or you're trying to do something after merger and acquisition, it's really important to know actually where you are at so that you can build from it. So understanding your current workplace culture, and the easiest way to do that is to listen to your people, to ask questions, to either introduce or to work with the tools and methods that you have to assess that culture in terms of surveys, focus groups, one-to-ones, interviews. And that doesn't have to be really complicated. Asking really simple questions about, for us, that's things like, what do you love about working at Hula? What's one thing we could do differently to improve your employee experience, to improve your work-life balance? And when you're asking these questions, to make sure that you're capturing that as much as possible in a way that helps you to build on it, and also to show the progress and the difference that you're making in the time that lies ahead. So creating that space for people to share. One of the things we try to do at Hula is encourage that always on mentality. So there are going to be times in the year when we ask you for your feedback and you have a survey, but there's never any invitation needed to do that. You can always contribute. So we have like a questions and suggestion space where people can chip in at any time. And I think it's really important that if you're asking all those questions, that you feed back on what's being shared and what you're going to do about it. So consistently at Hula, that's in the form of, you said, we did. And then be transparent about how you're doing what you're doing and how that success is measured. So when you're starting or redefining culture, having that baseline metrics of your data is so important. So what data do you already have in place? Some of that can be really quick wins. When we started, we looked at things like employee retention, length of service, our sickness absence days, our colleague to manager ratios, our gender pay gap. a lot of companies that we come across don't measure their gender pay gap because you don't have to report on it for quite a significant time in your growth. But actually, why would you wait until you have to report on it? Because then it's too late to do anything about it. So we started measuring that now so that we can close that gap over time. Very, very proud at Hula that we have a 20p gender pay gap. So it's something that we just need to maintain and work towards over time, and drill into that a little bit more detail. But when you know what data you have, you also know what's missing, and then how you want to measure that, and then what touch points do you need to put into place. So when we started really focusing on our EX journey at Hula, we found that we had a lot of those touch points in place. We already did 4-week check-ins after onboarding. We already did exit surveys, but they were much more interview-based. So the comments and feedback that you would share would obviously be quite subjective to the person who was delivering that at the time. And we never wanted to take, and I think it's really important not to take away from that human connection. So we're never saying that we use the tech or the data or surveys or whatever that might be to replace that in-person conversation, but only to enhance it. So we still have those touch points, but we also let people know that after that, they'll get a really quick survey to fill in. And some of that can be really awesome from an employer brand perspective. So for example, off the back of our onboarding surveys, we were able to share that for our starters who joined us in the last 12 months, they rated their onboarding experience 4.8 stars out of 5, which was an awesome metric to then be able to share as part of that recruitment and candidate experience of what people can expect when they're coming to join us. So once you know where you're starting from and you have an idea of that direction of travel that you're going in, the biggest thing I could advise, and the best advice that I had when I started out this, particularly as we started our sort of like UK to US expansion, was around back to basics, making sure that you have your fundamentals right and that what you do now is fit for purpose, but also helps you and enables you to scale. So we looked at this across our pillars. So coming back to that map on the first slide, but having that clear vision of why you do what you do. And all of this contributes to that great employee experience, aligning people with purpose. I think this is something that actually can get lost pretty easily in an employee experience journey as your business objectives change, priorities change, life changes, your remit changes, you get different jobs, promotions, that actually you constantly need to revisit back to what is the purpose of what I'm doing as an individual, but how does that align to business goals? Having really clear leadership and direction through the good times and the bad, which I'm going to revisit a little later. But like I said, managers playing such a clear role in that. Being inclusive, I think it's something that we say as if it should be really obvious, but actually it's not. I think there's a lot of time where you need to enable your people and make them feel comfortable to be their true, authentic selves so that they can have a better experience inside of work and therefore a better output, which is all driven by your values, your decision makings, how you talk to each other, and being intentionally mindful to the challenges that people face outside of work and how you do your absolute best to make sure that that doesn't come into that work environment, how their health, well-being, what's going on for them at home, their abilities, their disabilities, how that all impacts their ability to do their job well and what as an organization you need to do about it. Creating that culture of appreciation, I think that's twofold. The first one around peer-to-peer recognition, embedding that as part of your culture, shouting about your wins, shouting about the role in which you play, and also making sure that that's just something that you don't lose sight of in the busy times. It's really hard and really easy in that case to just go from onto the next without just taking that moment to celebrate your wins. And then the second part of that being around pay and perks and making sure that you're recognizing your people well for what you're doing. I'm going to talk about it a little later, but I think this was one of the big lessons learned for me around pay and recognition, is just really making sure that you benchmark yourselves against similar size organizations of what's realistic for your organization, because you'll see other companies and you'll think, oh, I wish we could do that, or I really would love us to do that, but we're just not quite there yet. It doesn't mean we're not going to get there, but what steps can we take and how can we do that in those increments that add up over time? Opportunity for growth. People need to be able to see how they can grow inside of work in terms of their career and their professional development, but also that work-life integration has never been tighter than it is now. So how does what you do inside of work contribute to someone's life outside of work, how they grow, what they want to get to, and where their ambitions are? And then similarly, balance between life in and outside of work, like post-pandemic, that's become such an important thing, even more so, and it's so much more at the forefront, but that will take different meanings at different times. For me, I'd always been, still am, super career motivated, but when I became a mama, that needed so much more of my attention and time for my little ones. And then I had to find that real balance of how do I do the job that I love with the babies that I love, and how does that mash together? And all of that underpinned by your company values. So keep coming back to it. We touch base with it frequently on any of our docs that we put out, presentations, company updates, performance conversations, one-to-ones. How do your values thread through all of that? And how, like your business goals, do you keep coming back to them and refreshing those? So once you know where you're heading, you've got the basics, it's then time to personalize that employee experience. This is something I could talk about for days. It's one of the things that I'm most passionate about, and the most things that I've loved doing inside of Hula. So we talk about personalizing employee experience, but I think it's much more about humanizing that employee experience. My background before I joined Hula wasn't HR, so I never came at it from that HR lens, always a people first lens. And I'm not saying that HR policies, process, all of that sort of stuff isn't important, but for us, it is something that we fall back on in times of need rather than something that guides our decision making. So finding that areas in which you can personalize your employee experience and bring that to life. And we're very lucky. We have an absolutely awesome creative team. So it's been very easy for us to take that visual employer brand and thread it through absolutely everything that we do. So it looks and feels very Hula as much as it's about the output of what we're delivering. So the way in which we did that was first with our culture book. I took huge pride in ripping apart our 134 plus page employee handbook that was filled with policies, procedures, corporate language that just wasn't reflective of what we were doing at Hula and where we were trying to get to create an 8-page culture book, which is all about who we are, why we do, what matters to us, our values, our approach to inclusivity, well-being, growth. So from there stemmed everything else. And then we looked at the touch points of that we could humanize and personalize and take a little back step to some of that HR language. So our probations used to be A4 Word documents. They're now personalized emails that include video content from their managers. So it's much more about them and what they contribute inside of work. Our contract letters come on really awesome headers that, you know, those big woohoo moments that really celebrate that. We created branded welcome cards, kudos cards. We put a front page on our contracts, the one that's in here, to show that, you know, an employment contract is probably one of the most formal documents that you can have, but it's also like the first touch point that somebody has within your organization. So we put the cover on it, and we put in a page on it about how lucky and privileged we feel that when anyone chooses to be part of Hula's journey, because it's a choice to join whatever organization you want to be a part of. We put our values there. So that was one of the first touch points that they saw. And then bigger picture, which is tough. It took a lot of time, but we started to review all of our policies and procedures to look at what was fit for purpose. So we said goodbye to policies like our disruptions to public transport or severe weather policy that ultimately just came back to how we feel about flexible working. If you're going to be late, talk to your manager. If you need to start early, finish late, whatever that might be, that's fine. It was all part of a much wider objective at Hula to build on that whole stance to flexible working. So we did a full policy review, condensed those down. One of the easiest things we did, but had quite a big impact, was humanizing our policies in terms of they were no longer the company said this. It was about, at Hula, we do this, we do this. As a collective, it's about we and us and not this corporate entity. And then we looked at the policies that over time we want to get to in terms of, enhanced sickness that we've just started to do, or extending out our family policies. So that's where sort of next level gets to, that takes a little bit more time. And then the second element to sort of personalizing that experience is also how you're utilizing your tech inside of your business to enable your employee experience. So there's much more of an expectation now that your people want that consumer grade digital experience inside of their tech. So in the way that you would personalize your desk at home with pictures of your kids or your dog or pets or family or sports teams, whatever that might be, you should be able to personalize your experience inside of work in the same way, and being really intentional about how you personalize the comms that you're sharing with your team. So not everybody needs to see everything all the time, but how do you get that content and information over at the time when it's most relevant to that person? And whilst you can do a lot of that on a group wide or a business level, you also need to acknowledge that individuality and consider what your team's diverse needs are and preferences. So how can you tailor that to your different employee resource groups, or depending on region, job role, office location, whatever that might be, that really takes it to that next level of personalization. And then lastly, just having that understanding of flexibility inside of all of that. There is no one size fits all. It should never be a static process. It's always something that needs adapting and changing over time. So I wanted to add this one in here because it's something that I've been really guilty of over my time, particularly when I joined Hula, because we create, or we were founded in bespoke HR and L&D systems. So we would create these awesome platforms across coaching, mentoring, talent management for these clients like Santander, L'Oreal, BT, all these amazing names that still blows my mind when they're in the office or we're talking to them or we're consulting on EX. But it was really easy to see what good looked like in those sorts of organizations, or, case studies and research that was that's putting a focus on that was ultimately amazing, but was aspirational. So what I started to do a lot more of, and that it really shapes what we do now, is being much more mindful of benchmarking ourselves, or what does good look like in organizations of a similar scale and size, whether that's in terms of revenue or headcount. I know she's on this session, but my colleague Ella and I can be really, really guilty of running away with our thoughts and getting really excited by things, and then constantly having to bring ourselves back to basics and back to that intentional of, right, what do we want to achieve? Where were we aiming for? And how does this align to that? And never losing sight of that aspiration, but knowing that we're going to take steps to get there. And very much walking before we run. So getting the basics right now, and also looking at, as we scale, is a video from every manager to every employee in their team as part of probation. Is that realistic? I'd like to think so. I'd like to think that as we scale up, that we continue to do much more of that as possible. But once you get into those headcounts of 1,000, 3,000, 10,000, whatever that might be, it's looking at how do we keep this employee experience journey that we're so very proud of, and how do we continue to do that at scale. So keeping very focused on your destination. And then the biggest one, I think, around understanding how your people agenda, your strategy, aligns to business goals. Business goals change over time. They can change quite quickly depending on what's going on in not just in your business, but your sector or the wider work landscape. So constantly pulling back to how, as a people team, you're contributing to those business goals, and also how you enable your people to do that consistently as well. So through performance management conversations, how you're documenting all of that, how often you're revisiting it to make sure that those business metrics around performance are always really aligned to your people, and coming back to that culture map, their purpose inside of their organization as well. And then last up, no journey is ever a straight road. You will have bumps in the road. There will be times where things come up that you didn't expect, or you're surprised by something and you have to adapt quickly. I know we're not alone in this, and it's a personal thing for us to share, but recently we had to make a couple of redundancies at Hula. And that was one of the biggest tests on our culture that we've ever had. It's really easy to have a great culture when things are going really well. It's actually in those hard times that your culture matters the most. So I think it's really important in these moments not to default back to what is easy or comfortable or safe in terms of that HR process or language, but actually you need to keep it human at every point. So whether that is something like redundancies, or whether that's a difficult conversation that a manager is having with one of their team, or performance management conversations, whatever that might be, making sure that you're always keeping it human. Being intentional in those moments with how you communicate, and actually, if anything, we've learned in those moments, over communication is better. So making sure you're constantly touching back to, this might have happened, or this is the reason why something's done or something's changed, but this is how we're going to move forward from it. And this is the road that lies ahead and what people can expect. So being quite intentional with that at all parts of your EX journey, I think is really important, and being clear on that way forward. Keeping your virtual door open in more of that hybrid setting of just making sure you're always receptive to those questions, those listening, those touch points, that actually when things are hard and you might not be wanting to hear what's coming out of it, that actually you should do a lot more of that, because it gives people that voice to share, but also that ultimate trust and transparency that you build with people is through these moments as well. And to find your HR for HR. I've seen so much on LinkedIn around, there is no HR for HR. There is, you just have to find it, whether that's your external network, the people in your organization, your leadership team. So making sure that you always have that resource for your people in those times as well. So there's, again, so much more that I would love to share. Very, very happy to share anything here that we've talked about in terms of our culture book, what we're doing with our policies, procedures, some of those personalization pieces that we've talked about. More than happy to share any of that in more details, and just a quick summary there of what we've talked about today. But in terms of understanding your starting point, making sure you're nailing your basics, personalize that experience and that digital experience as much as you can, stay focused and minimize those distractions, and navigate through those challenges as they come. And that is pretty much it from me. So would love to keep in touch with anyone who's found the session valuable, or always happy to connect with other people in that space, because it's really important for us as Hula that whilst we have our amazing Inspiring Workplace accreditation now, we always want to be doing more and learning and shaping that. I'm not sure I understand. That was perfect timing from Siri. But thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Suzi. That was so insightful. And it's great to see another live example of things that you guys are doing great. I love how you're talking about humanizing your policies. That's the first I've heard of that. Where did that initiative come from?
I think it was just more around, you can't have a culture on one page that says something and then it's not reflective behind the scenes. So I didn't want it from an external or an internal perspective, being like, oh, well, you talk all this talk, but actually when it comes down to it, your policies don't match that or aren't reflective of it. And there's things, like I mentioned, that over time I would absolutely love us to get to, but I think just the starting point of humanizing that and making that employer brand and voice feel consistent through every touch point is so important. And actually there's nothing worse than a really intimidating policy that's thrown on your desk in times where they're needed. So I never wanted that to be a thing, in the same way that I would never want, if someone has to speak to HR in our organization, that's because something has gone wrong, or not, because actually HR are humans too, and we want to have that human connection as well.
Yeah, that's great. I'd love to hear that coming from, someone who's actually walking the walk and talking the talk, so to speak. I also, one thing that stood out to me, just looking at your culture map, was the culture of appreciation. I haven't heard that much out there. Is that, how has that impacted the organization since you started working with that?
Yeah, I think finding a way to do this really well digitally was challenging at first. So Pre-pandemic, we had printed kudos cards in all of the office, and people could write messages and send it to each other. And we completely, obviously biased because we use our own product, Hula Hub, internally, but having a digital peer-to-peer recognition system was great. So we launched that in September, and then we've got almost 300 pieces of recognition shared over the last sort of 6 months or so. So it's very much around how you as people leaders in a business can enable that in whatever's right for you. But what we then saw that shift as appreciation from manager to individual in their team to peer-to-peer across teams. That was the shift that we really enjoyed seeing, because then it became cultural and not because it was part of a performance conversation or because you feel like you should. And it's a great tool as a people leader to see what's going on in the business, so that when you want to intentionally connect with someone, we can look back to that kudos feed and go, oh, okay, Susie, like, loved that presentation that you did, heard it went really well. And you have that sort of inroad to people as well. So I think it's always going to be hard, and it's always going to take work until something becomes habitual. And at the point it becomes habitual, then it becomes like that culture change and impact.
Yeah, that's great. And, this is a great example of how our technology can help in supporting that. So, and you have a fan here, someone saying, loving this session, Susie, lots of great actionable steps to build a winning workplace culture. So that's great.